for logistical reasons, and Robert's going to...
Okay, thank you.
Is that now?
My speaker's working, I guess. So this paper is entitled Owner-Occupied Housing in the CPI and its Impact on Monetary Policy During Housing Booms and Busts. It's joint work with Miriam Steurer from University of Graz and Sofie Waltl from Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research, and it's also funded by the Australian Research Promotion Agency, FFG. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? Well, by way of introduction, I'll say a bit about why include owner-occupied housing in the CPI. Then we'll look at the main methods for including housing. These are the acquisitions approach, rental equivalence, and the user cost methods, and we'll say something about the pluses and minuses of each of these. But then we'll also talk about a kind of new hybrid method we've thought of, which combines aspects of user cost and rental equivalence. Then we apply the methods empirically to data for Sydney, Australia. So this allows us to actually see how much difference does it make, which method you use to the CPI. The reason for choosing Sydney is the Australian Bureau of Statistics computes a separate CPI for each of the main cities. So there's a CPI specifically for Sydney, and we also have detailed micro-level housing data for Sydney. So we're able to strip out owner-occupied housing from the Sydney CPI and then put it back in using different methods. Actually, we're in the process of revising the paper at the moment, and we're going to extend the empirical comparisons and actually try and, for some of these methods, look at what the impact would be on the US CPI and also for some European countries. But we can only do this for some of the methods for the broader, in the broader context. And then we finish by looking a bit, first of all, how much difference does it make to measured inflation, but then we'll talk, at least in the revised draft, we're going to talk a bit about the disinflation puzzle in the United States, and also more generally the implications for monetary policy. So, the Consumer Price Index, it measures the price of goods and services consumed by households. What's it used for? Monetary policy. I mean, for example, the inflation, the measure of inflation that's used in an inflation target, but it's also used for indexation of public sector wages, other government expenditure, legal contracts, and as a benchmark for private sector wage negotiations, amongst other things. Our position here is how you treat owner-occupied housing may depend on exactly what you're trying to do with it. So our focus in this paper is on monetary policy, not on indexation. And we think you can make a case, for example, for excluding owner-occupied housing completely when you're looking at indexation. If you think of owner-occupied housing, for example, in the rental equivalence version, where you're you're imagining people are paying imputed rent, owners are paying imputed rent to themselves. In that sense, they're directly compensated for any change in house prices, because the extra imputed rent they have to pay, they pay to themselves. So it's not clear. It's an interesting issue, owner-occupied housing, for indexation versus monetary policy, and we might write a separate paper on that topic. But here, we're just looking at monetary policy, not indexation. So I just want to make that clear for a start. In the context of monetary policy, we're trying to look at the change in the purchasing power of money, and housing is a very important part, obviously, of consumer expenditure. So that's the reason why you really want to have it in the CPI in that context. Another reason you might add as well is all countries include rents in their CPIs, but the size of the rental market can differ quite dramatically across countries. For example, in Eastern Europe, it's often less than 10%. In countries like Germany and Austria, it's a lot higher. It can be approaching 50%. And so if you exclude owner-occupied housing, this introduces a kind of asymmetry as to the extent that the housing market is being represented in the CPI. So if you want to make comparisons, have your comparisons across countries based on, if you want them to be equivalent in some sense, that's another reason for including owner-occupied housing. So let's look a bit at these different methods. So first of all, what do you need to include owner-occupied housing in the CPI, you basically, just to include anything in the CPI, you need an expenditure share for it. What's its share of total consumption? And you also need a price index for it. So for each of these methods, the question is, how do you construct the OOH expenditure share, and how do you construct the price index? That's the question in each case. And who does what? In the EU, Eurostat it currently excludes owner-occupied housing completely from the harmonised index of consumer prices, but it's trying, actually since about 2004, there have been plans to include owner-occupied housing, and the decision was made to do it using the acquisitions method. Miriam Steurer and myself actually have been advising Eurostat on this inclusion of owner-occupied housing, and that's how we kind of got interested in this topic in the first place. But I mean, I've got to say, but from Eurostat's point of view, their job is a lot harder because they need a method. They want all countries in Europe to use the same method. After all, it's a harmonised index, so they want all countries to use the same method. And the problem is what can be done in one country may not be feasible in another country. So it's a particularly hard problem for Eurostat. It's easier if you're just looking at individual countries. So, but anyway, so far they still haven't managed to get owner-occupied housing into the CPI. So this is kind of 14 years and counting on that. So Australia and New Zealand also use the acquisitions approach. Outside Europe, most countries use rental equivalents, particularly the United States. Actually, many European countries also use rental equivalents in their own CPIs, I mean, separate from the harmonised index. And for example, the CPIH here in the UK uses rental equivalents. But there are a few countries that use versions of user cost, Canada, Sweden, and Iceland being, I think, the main three there. Okay, so let's look a bit at each of these methods. I have to say we're not fans of the acquisitions approach, which is part of what got us into this topic. So the acquisitions approach, you want to treat housing like any other consumer durable, like a car. So you include new cars, you exclude second-hand cars. So the same principle with houses, you'd include new houses, you exclude second-hand transactions of existing houses. But housing is different because from typical consumer durables, because you've got two parts to it. You've got the structure and the land. And the idea here is you want to include the structure and exclude the land because the land is not produced. Now, it's actually not too hard to come up with an expenditure share for housing excluding land. You just go to the national accounts and find residential construction from the national accounts, and that gives you your expenditure share. Now, the price index, now there's a difference here between the Australia-New Zealand version and Eurostat version. The Australia version, it just takes a kind of price index for building materials, while the Eurostat is trying to do a version where it's a price index for newly built housing, including the land component. So the land component would come in the price index for Eurostat, while it would be completely excluded from the Australia-New Zealand version. Now, why don't we like acquisitions? Well, I think you're throwing away the most interesting bit, or most important bit, which is land. I mean, it's most of the action in the housing market is land. Additional criticisms of it is residential construction is a highly volatile component of GDP as well. It really goes up in booms, down in recessions, so that could introduce volatility to the CPI. The Eurostat version, it's a bit of a mix. You're not including land in the weights, expenditure weights, but you are including it in the price index, and also constructing a price index for newly built housing can be problematic, particularly in smaller countries. Like some of the European countries, take Slovenia, they hardly have enough transactions of new apartments and houses to actually construct a price index for new housing. The Australian version, I mean, I would complain that it throws away everything that we care about, kind of. So all the land is completely gone, and you end up with an index where you say, why bother? I mean, it's hard. And we'll see this in the empirical results. If you do it the Australian way, you may as well not bother including OOH at all. So rental equivalence, what you do there is you take you try and ask the question, what would these apartments and houses that are owner-occupied, what would they rent for? And if you can estimate those rents, that provides the expenditure share. And you can take two different approaches to this. You can do surveys, ask people how much would, owners, you could ask how much would this apartment or house rent for, or you could do some kind of hedonic econometric estimation to figure out what these owner-occupied properties would rent for. the price index is then a price index for rents for the user cost approach. Now, our criticisms, I mean, we prefer user cost, right? So let's put it on the table immediately. But what are our objections to rental equivalence? I mean, we prefer rental equivalence to acquisitions, so that's the first thing to say. But, I mean, our problems with rental equivalence, I mean, firstly, you know, the services you obtain as a renter are not the same as the ones necessarily you get as an owner-occupier of the same property. But there are other issues here, like, you know, is the rental market big enough and representative enough to allow you to impute rents for owner-occupied housing? You could have situations where, you know, the rental market is quite small. For example, in Eastern Europe, as I mentioned, the rental markets are very small, also in countries like Spain and Italy. And it's not clear you have enough a big enough rental market to really do rental equivalence, which is incidentally why Eurostat did not do rental equivalence. A lot of countries said they just can't do it. And you know, if you've got rent control as well, that further complicates things. So that's on the expenditure share side, right? But on the price index side, we also have an objection that in a housing booms and busts, rents and house prices can do very different things. So house prices will tend to rise strongly in the boom, while rents won't necessarily do that much. And similarly, when house prices crash, again, rents don't do so much. So if you really want to capture what's going on in the market, we would argue you need to have a price index for actual house price index, not a rent index. And things are made worse still by often these rent indexes are not really looking at what you want, which is the current market rents. It's often these rents are kind of stale surveys of existing renters, and there's a paper recently, Coulson and co-authors, saying that in the United States the rental series is really, you know, not up to what we need. I mean, it's not really capturing current trends in the rental market. It's too much based on old data. So anyway, so those are our objections to rental equivalence. So what about user cost? So with user cost, you need to have a kind of per dollar user cost, which is UT, and then PT would be the price of a house or an apartment, and so the total user cost would be PT times UT. So you could compute that at the level of each property if you know UT and you know the price of each property. Now UT is kind of capturing the total costs of per dollar invested in the house of owning. So it's opportunity costs and actual costs. So you can think of they're less and more complicated versions of this user cost formula. This is a fairly simple one because I mean, for example, if you can tax deduct mortgage interest payments as an owner-occupier, the formula becomes more complicated. But okay, so interest rate here is in here because, you know, you're foregoing interest by investing in the housing market. You've got the depreciation of the property. You've got the omegas, the running costs and average transaction costs. Gamma's a risk premium to capture the idea about the differences in the risk of owning versus renting. In our empirical comparison, we set that to 0 because it's not even clear whether that's positive or negative. Then you've got the expected rate of inflation, and then last of all, the expected real capital gain on housing. And this is what causes the biggest problems with the user cost approach, is what do you do with this capital gain term? Because you don't observe expected capital gain, so how do you compute the thing? Okay, now there's another use of this user cost. I mean, okay, that user cost formula is used sometimes to look at departures from equilibrium in the housing market, because the idea is that owner-occupiers should be indifferent, households, should be indifferent between owning and renting. So that means the user cost, UT times PT, in equilibrium should equal RT, the cost of renting, right? And if you're interested in applying that equilibrium condition, then expected capital gains need to be in there. But it's not so clear they need to be in there if you're putting owner-occupied housing into the CPI. For example, you know, a positive expected capital gains would imply negative consumption expenditure, and it's not clear that the compilers of the CPI, you know, want to treat capital gains as negative expenditure. There are other issues. One, for a start, is one way of including expected capital gains is to just assume people extrapolate from past trends. Like, and in the empirical results we show that. You could say, if you say we expect this year the average of what happened over the last 10 years, the last 20 years, or the last 30 years. So we present those results in the paper. But we argue that actually leads to a downward bias, systematic downward bias in the CPI if you do it that way, because what that would mean is when house prices are rising, the expenditure share goes down on owner-occupied housing, gets less weight when house prices are rising, and when house prices are falling, then the weight goes up. And that kind of introduces a systematic bias. So we go through that in the appendix of the paper, some examples of how this happens. So in other words, so far we look at we look at a few different versions of user cost. One where we exclude capital gains completely, and then where we base capital gains on extrapolating performance from the previous 10, 20, and 30 years. But we look at one other version as well, which is this kind of what we call a user cost rental equivalence hybrid. So we're in the process of revising the paper, and this bit on the user cost rental equivalence hybrid isn't in the paper yet. But another possible approach for expected capital gains is to say, assume expected capital gains are at their break-even level. This means they're at a level such that the cost of renting equals the user cost. And if you assume that, then that means that you effectively can use the rental equivalence expenditure shares, but you use a house price index rather than a rent index. Now, why do we kind of like this method? Well, for one thing, it will be when you're using a house price index, it's going to be more sensitive to what's actually happening in the housing market than rental equivalence. You're going to get the cost of owner-occupied housing is going to go up when house prices are rising, and down when house prices are falling. It also won't depend on the interest rate. This is one objection central banks have to the user cost method. I mean, if inflation is going up, so the central bank wants to raise interest rates to try and get inflation down again, you don't want the first thing that happens is when you raise interest rates, the CPI immediately jumps upwards. And so that can happen. It depends on what interest rate you use. But if you do this kind of hybrid method, that avoids that completely because you use the rental equivalence expenditure shares. And they tend to be slightly more stable than the user cost expenditure shares. I mean, the implication of this is you'd be saying that you expect a high capital gain when the price-rent ratio is high. You expect a low capital gain when the price-rent ratio is low. That's the kind of implication of this approach. Now, our kind of conclusion now is that we like this. So we call it UBE for BE, break even. So this is, user cost where you're assuming capital gains are always at their break-even level. So the view we're coming round to is we like this method when there's enough of a rental market to do it. Now, in countries where there's not enough of a rental market, we go to this thing we call U0, which is user cost, where you exclude capital gains completely. Okay, so let's get on to the empirical part of this. So, can we take them at the end? Advice has been we take the questions at the end. So, yeah. So, okay. So we have detailed micro data for Sydney, 340,000 observations for prices for houses, 216 for apartments, 16,000 for apartments, and also for rents on the same characteristics. So we're able to estimate hedonic models. Let me skip over this estimation stuff. So we're able to estimate hedonic models for houses and apartments that sell and ones that rent, and then we can impute from one to the other. We can go to the hedonic model and say this is what this apartment, say, that sold would have rented for in this year if it had been rented, and similarly for houses that rented, or apartments, we can impute a price for them, and we do estimate separate models for rents for houses, rents for apartments, prices for houses, and prices for apartments. And we also then construct house price indices. Let's skip over. We use hedonic imputation price index formulae. And this is what we find empirically, that over this period, the rents rose more strongly than house prices in Sydney. The solid line is the rents, the dashed line is house prices. Now, by way of context, the previous 10 years have been a strong housing boom in Sydney. So what the way to interpret this in a sense is rents catching up with what had been happening to house prices before that. So if we do our user cost, we have to specify values for all the elements of the per dollar user cost. We mostly use just the numbers used by Fox and Tulip, who both work at the Reserve Bank of Australia, so on a paper they wrote where they were trying to do user costs. So we typically take their numbers. Let's skip over that. I want to go to, okay, so here, the average monthly OOH expenditure shares. So you see there U0, well, let's start at the far end is acquisition, so it's only 12% expenditure share in Australia over this period. And it gets adjusted every 5 years or so, but we decided not to. So there was a later version we could have, a later household expenditure survey we could have used, but we decided not to update it, to just leave it with how it was in 2004. Rental, because it would have introduced a kind of discrete jump into the results for acquisitions. So the rental equivalent share is about 21%, and you see the U0, which is the user cost without any capital gains, is quite a bit higher at 29%. Now, these other methods, U10, U20, U30, are where you're including capital gains based on extrapolating on past trends. Now, the expenditure shares are a lot lower there because of the strong capital gains in the Sydney market. So the strong capital gains then implies, with these methods, strong expected capital gains, and so then you end up with lower expenditure shares. Now, so here we actually have the CPI then. What's the implications for the CPI? We have 2.63% average over, this is average over the period 2004 to 2014. You have 2.63% if you exclude OOH. If you do acquisitions the Australian way, you get 2.7%. So this is what I mean, it's hardly worth the bother of doing the Australian way. Acquisitions with Europe, it's a bit higher, 2.85%, because then you've got the price index, which includes land. And then rental equivalence is the highest here because house prices rents were rising faster than house prices. That's 2.3% basically. And then you see the user cost methods, the U0 and UBE, where the user cost break even, they're very similar at about 3.17%. But basically, including OOH is increasing, with our preferred methods, is pushing up the CPI by about 0.5%. Now, if we look at the implications for other countries, and more generally, over this period, house prices rose by 4.95% a year on average, and the inflation was only 2.6%. So this is, house prices are rising by more than 2% a year in real terms over this sample. Now, how does that compare with other countries? So there's a paper recently, Knoll, Schulerich, and Steger, who look at trends in a number of countries. And so this is not atypical. These are increases in real house prices per year. So, a bit over 2%. Is quite usual in OECD countries. So what we're saying is what we're observing for Sydney, can generalise to other countries. Now, here we did a kind of simulation and saying here we'd be saying lambda is what's the increase in real house prices. So here in Sydney it was just over 2%, which would imply there a 1 year increase in CPI of just over, of around about 0.5%. But you can see here, if you go up to 5%, you'd be having a CPI increase of 1.2%, being 1.2% higher a year than otherwise. All right, I'm running out of time, so let me just say this quickly. One thing we want to look at is the disinflation puzzle in the US. This is this debate over, let me read the quote from Williams, for example. The surprise about inflation is that it's fallen so little given the depth and duration of the recent downturn. So in America, in the downturn, inflation, with the global financial crisis, inflation didn't fall much, and then with the subsequent recovery, inflation didn't rise much. So there's a big growing literature in looking at this issue of trying to explain it, and lots of different explanations have been offered. But we think another explanation here is the way OOH is treated in the US CPI. They do rental equivalence there, but they're using a very bad rental index, which doesn't capture what's really going on in the housing market. And we think, particularly if you switch to one of our user costs, U0 or U break even, you get a much bigger fall. You get a significant fall in the US CPI in the recession and a subsequent big recovery subsequently. And this could explain quite a bit of this disinflation puzzle, but we haven't done that yet. So, okay, we're almost there. So the final two slides, implications for monetary policy. So, well, if this helps resolve the disinflation puzzle, it means that how you treat owner-occupied housing in the CPI can have implications for our understanding of the Phillips curve. Also, I mean, given that house prices are rising in real terms in most countries in the OECD, the implication here is excluding OOH is going to lead to a lower CPI than we actually have. So, for example, the harmonized index of consumer prices in Europe currently excludes it. Right? So then, but if we included it, it would go up because on average house prices are rising. And if, for example, if you have an inflation target of 2%, then that would imply higher interest rates. But obviously, if you include OOH, you could adjust your inflation target as well. So the final slide then. One other issue we just want to mention is that if you do a user cost approach, it would likely generate some natural leaning against the wind. This is the thing about saying when interest rates go up, when house prices go up, should the central bank depart from an inflation target and raise interest rates to try and cool down the housing market? And we say that if you include owner-occupied housing using our kind of user cost approaches, that this will happen naturally, that when the house prices rise, the CPI will go up. And so if you've just got a standard inflation target, that will naturally elicit the response in terms of monetary policy. Now, there is a debate over whether central banks should lean against the wind. Svensson, for example, argues against it. But so we don't really want to take a stand on whether central banks should lean against the wind. But what we do say, and this is the final point, is that it should be really a prerequisite to this debate. First, you look at how does owner-occupied housing go into the CPI first, and only then should you talk about whether you should be leaning against the wind or leaning with the wind or neither. Right. So first, you've got to see how the CPI is already responding to house prices, or if it's not doing so, and that depends on how you treat OOH. Thank you.
So we're going to. Works. Right. Okay, so we'll take the questions at the end, if that's okay. So
okay, yeah.
What I'm going to talk about is calculating a constant quality of price index for the stock of residential housing. It's joint work with Rhy Lewis and Kishan Rana, who I think are looking at us on the wide screen in Newport. Hi. What's the need for a stock-weighted house price? Well, most current measures of house prices around the world are based on the measure, they look at house prices based on the stock, the flow of houses sold, flow of house sales. But obviously the houses which are sold in a particular period will not generally be representative of the stock. There's only about 4.2% of houses are sold each year. It's a very small proportion. And obviously some houses are more likely to be sold than others. So, I mean, if the flow was actually representative of the stock, then it would be, if we looked at any particular housing characteristic, we'd find that the probability of being sold would be the same as in the aggregate. But we find that isn't the case. So we look at three, just to illustrate it. There's a frequency bias, so that we've got the aggregate. Does this thing do a line? Anyway, it doesn't. Okay. Well, there's the aggregate B, which is 4.2%. And if we partition in a particular way the housing stock with shares AI, and each element of the partition has a probability BI of being sold, you get that relationship. And that implies that if we look at the shares in the flow, AI star, then those will be related to the stock shares and the Bernoulli probabilities in the following way. So that if BI, the probability of type I being sold, is higher than the aggregate B, then it'll be represented more in the flow. Fairly straightforward relationship. Well, is there a frequency bias? That's the first question in practice. So people have often talked about this, but we've actually got the data, and we can look at it in a few dimensions. So we just picked out a couple here. So we look at it by local authority area. So the little dotted line there is 4.2%, the aggregate one. This is for England and Wales, by the way, although the method can be applied to Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. So we see some areas you get a lot more, are much more likely to be sold than in others. So, for example, you've got Elmbridge and St Albans are there. There are a lot of houses being sold in these locations. Whereas just here, it's not actually labelled there. You've got the Isles of Scilly is the least likely place to sell a house. So you get quite a range of variation there across by local authority. We look at acorn categories. So for those of you who aren't familiar with acorn categories, this is a socio-economic division categorization, which is made down to the local authority, down to the by postcode. And we've just got the group, we've got the categories here, where we've actually looked at it in much more detail than that, but here are the basic categories. So we've got the affluent achievers, rising prosperity, comfortable communities, financially stretched, and urban adversity. And again, we can see there's quite a lot of variation there. There's a lot more houses being sold in those postcodes where you have affluent achievers and rising prosperity, and not much going on where you have a bit of urban adversity. So there's clearly variation in frequencies as we look at these different ways of partitioning the stock of housing. So what we wanted to do was to develop a stock-weighted house price index, something which really represented what was going on, reflecting the whole stock of houses. So the first question here is, what do we mean by the stock of housing? So you could take, there are two possible meanings, well, there are more than two, but we can concentrate on two. There's a stock of all housing right across the board, owner-occupied, social housing and private rental. Or you could have a more narrowly focused one, just looking at the stock of owner-occupied housing. The method, you can do both, but what we actually implemented in this paper was the first one. We looked at the stock of all housing. And I'll explain a little bit how you do the owner-occupied one towards the end. So we're starting from the way the current housing price index is constructed. There was a big review about this a few years ago, I think it was 2015, and an all-new method was introduced. And essentially, this is roughly how it works. So we start off with the transactions, from the information from HM Land Registry. This gives us all the prices of all the transactions. So it's about 80 to 100,000 per month. This is the price paid data set, for those of you who are interested. And we get, with that data, it's combined with data from the Valuation Office Agency. So this provides, for each house that's sold, you can look up in the Valuation Office Agency the characteristics of it. So is it a new house? What type of house is it? Is it a detached, semi-detached, whatever? What's the floor space, and so on, and its location. So these two types of information are then combined using a hedonic regression. So essentially, the transactions price is explained, if you like, by these various factors, as we saw in a similar way to the previous paper. So all of these variables, the xi's in this case, are nearly all dummy variables. So, for example, number of rooms, it's not a scalar variable where the number of rooms is from 1 to 8. We have a dummy for 1 room, a dummy for 2 rooms, a dummy for 3 rooms, etc. The only one that isn't is floor space. So floor space is meters squared, but everything else is a dummy. So that's how the current HPI is constructed. So we thought, well, there's been a lot of thought on this in the ONS, so we'll just take that methodology and just apply it to the stock. I'll just say a couple of words about it, though. In effect, each characteristic of a house is given a value, which it contributes to the overall house price. And because it's all in logs, it's all proportional. It's a proportional method. And the actual HPI is constructed as a geometric mean. Basically, we take the characteristics, we take the prices which we've estimated, those little beta hats, and we've used those to construct the aggregate house price index. So the interesting thing about it, because it's log linear, is all it depends really on is a distribution of the characteristics in the flow of transactions data. And to get the actual figures which are recorded, you just raise that to the exponential. Now, what about the weighting? And here's really the key point. So the weights for each characteristic represent, in the current HPI, represent the proportions of houses having that characteristic in the transactions data over a particular period. So in the UK, what they do is the weights are derived from the previous year's transactions and applied in the subsequent year's transactions. It varies internationally. Sometimes they take 3-year averages and so on. Some update it every year, some update it every few years. And indeed, those alternatives have been looked at in the UK as well. But what the current practice is, they take the transactions for the previous year and use those weights, those are the QIs, to weight the prices which have been estimated using the hedonic regression. So, but of course, as we've just seen, there's a frequency bias here. The transactions in a particular calendar year will not be representative of the stock because there's frequency bias. So for a stock housing price index, we need to use the rates reflecting the actual stock. And so the method that we implied, and which is fairly straightforward to implement, is to use the prices estimated for the current house price index, which is based on the transactions, and apply that to the stock. So we've got dwelling stock estimates. There's quite a lot of houses in the UK, in England and Wales. The biggest group is owner-occupied housing, 16 million, more or less. There's a private rented sector, about 5 million, and there's social housing, 4.2 million, which divides into local authority and basically housing associations, registered private providers for the technical name. So that's the dwelling stock estimates by tenure. So it raises the question then, is it valid to use the prices from the HPI to value the stock? This is something we spend a bit of time worried about. Because obviously the transactions that you find in the land registry price paid data will consist mainly of transactions at full market prices. For example, it excludes all the stuff on right to buy of social housing. And it's mostly from the owner-occupied stock. Well, I'll just say a couple of things. The number of sales of social housing is actually quite small. It's something of the order of just over 20,000 a year. So that's a couple of % of total transactions. So social housing doesn't really sell very often, as you would expect. But however, whilst there are few sales of social housing, there are lots of ex-social housing in the owner-occupied stock. Since 1980, something like 2 million social houses have been sold and become part of the owner-occupied thing. So the private rental sector is very diverse, but includes many houses that are similar to owner-occupied. So what we think is that although it's mainly owner-occupied transactions which are in the HPI, there's a lot of stuff which has very similar characteristics in terms of location, type of build, and so on to the social housing because it's ex-social housing. So if we want to look, all we do really is we replace the flow weights in the HPI and replace them with the stock weights. Where do we can look at how these differ. Where do we get the data from? We get it from the same place, the Valuations Office Agency. The data is there, and for that actually Britain is very, very lucky. So no other major country publishes a stock house price index. No other country does it. It's not been done before. We're very lucky in Britain that that data does exist and that we can actually implement this in a fairly straightforward way. And if it's chosen to become a national statistic or a published statistic, it'll be the first country to do that, major country to do that. And I can talk a little bit more about other countries later on if you wish. So let's just do a couple of comparisons of the stock and flow. So we can look at house types, detached, so this is one way of partitioning all the housing, detached, semi-detached, terrace and flat. So there's the blue one is the stock and the other colour is the flow, the greeny type one. So what we see there is that there's systematic differences between the two in terms of their composition. A lot more flats in the stock than in the flow, a lot more detached houses in the flow than the stock, and so on. Again, we can do similarly compare the weights across local authorities. Now, it's a rather squiggly diagram, and let me just explain it. So what we've done firstly is we've ranked local authorities, ranked by stock. So the blue line, the nice smooth blue line is ranked by stock, and the red line is the flow weights, which squiggle around it. In the bottom one, we've done exactly the opposite. We've ranked by the flow, and the squiggly blue line are the stock weights. Birmingham comes top of both because it's the biggest local authority for both. And probably the Isles of Scilly is probably the last one. So there you see that the two are obviously related, but there's quite a lot of variation. Some of these, they don't vary perfectly together by any means. And you can see this if you look at a case of London boroughs. On the website for the ONS, you can see some other comparisons as well. But here are London boroughs. There's quite a lot of them, as you can see there. The blue is a stock, and the other colour is the flow. So you can see in some cases, like, and let me just get the right ones here. So Islington and Kensington, Chelsea, the blue line is a lot bigger than the other one. What that means is that the stock of housing in those two boroughs is a lot bigger than the flow that you observe in transactions. And you see the reverse there in some other places like Wandsworth and Bromley. So there's quite a lot of variation in terms of differences between stocks and flows within London, and you can look across the whole of the UK and make a similar sort of comparison. I just really want to show this to just say there's quite a lot of variety that goes on there. Well, if we do this, what do we get? What do we get? And so what we've done is, it's mainly Kishan that's done this, we've taken the 2015 weights for the stock. We haven't backdated the stock data. The stock doesn't change very much. There's about 1% change in the stock, new bills and stuff. So the stock changes very slowly, though obviously it will have changed over this 20-year period, but it's quite difficult to backcast that. But we've got the flow data going back to 1995. So the flow data is pretty accurate. So this is the price levels. This is the level of the house price index from 1995 to 2015. So the stock is the blue line. The other colour, the brownie type colour, is the UK HPI, and that's on the left-hand side. So that's the price of the houses. The black line is the percentage difference between the two. So as we see over this long period, at the beginning of the period, there wasn't a huge difference between the two. It was only a few percent, about 3%. At the end, it's nearer 11%, so it's gone up. But we can see it's not monotonic. It was flat for a very long period. In fact, it even went down a bit in the 2006-7 period. It fell, and it was fairly flat from 2002 to 2011, and it went up. So, this is just a 20-year window on house prices. So we can see if we look at these stock and flow measures, probably the stock will tend to be lower than the flow. But the distance between the two, we can expect that to vary over time. But of course, we don't normally focus on the price level. What we often focus on is the growth rates. This is the interesting thing. And here are the growth rates from over the same period. Again, we've got the blue is the stock, and the brown is the flow, and the little black lines are the difference in terms of percentage on the right-hand scale. So as we can see, they do vary quite closely together. So you might say, they tell a fairly familiar story in terms of house price inflation. We're not getting some radically different bit. But there are differences, and if you look at the percentage line, they can be quite large differences at certain periods. So I think usually the flow measure is higher than the stock measure, so it's an average of 3.5% higher. So in general, the stock house pricing inflation is lower. But despite that, out of 55 out of 240 months, it's the other way around. So sometimes it's reversed. It's not a universal thing. And there's actually quite a lot of variation, as you can see. You've got, the differences can be minus 5% or plus 5%. So there's quite a lot of variation going on there over time. So generally they do vary together, but there's also quite a lot of differences as well. So we can actually look at the decompose. What's the main cause of the differences? So it's really quite simple. The only thing that differs are the weights, so it's a very simple decomposition here. So this is the only algebra, Richard. There's no matrices needed for this. It's a fairly simple decomposition there. And we're just looking at 2015 here. So we're just looking at 1 year, decomposing it. And there's a more detailed table available. But essentially, the main thing is the acorn. It's the acorn groupings which cause the main differences. It's the socio-economic variables, which are sort of capturing, if you like, the nature of social housing tending to be in poorer areas and so on and so forth. So the acorn grouping is the big one. The number of rooms is the second. Floor space, house type, and location. So that's a sort of ranking you get there if you decompose this difference. It's quite an interesting one. I'd have never guessed that the acorn. I'd never heard of acorn groups before I did this study, but they're clearly one of the most important aspects in these house price in explaining house prices. And when you think about it, if you think about it as a socio-economic variable, it's a marketing variable, but essentially it's a socio-economic one. That's probably what's going on. So that's that, and we could just look in a little bit more detail about acorn groups. So we actually look at it. There are categories. There are 18 groups, and there's an even more disaggregated level. We're just looking at the top level, which is the category. And as you can see, in the stock, you've got a lot more in the stock. The financially stretched and urban adversity bits shares are much bigger, whereas in the flow, there's a lot more affluent achievers and rising prosperity. So, that's really explaining the difference between these two measures. We can also look at habitable rooms. It's quite interesting. It's this one that explains most of the difference. So that when you look at it, the number of habitable rooms has a weight, but the one that's crucial is the fact that in the stock there's a lot more two habitable room places than there are in the flow. This is habitable rooms. It's excluding kitchens and bathrooms and toilets and so on. But it's that one that really makes the number of rooms count, the two. And here's floor space. As you'd expect, you get a bit more floor space in the flow. But as you can see, it's not all one-sided. So in some ranges, it goes the other way around. But you tend to see the stock, the brown one is higher towards the origin, and the blue one is higher above. So you get more space in the private in transacted houses than you do in social housing. Okay, now what about the weights over time? Okay, I'll just finish. I'll just say, so the stock weights are exactly the same. They don't change at all. But the flow weights do change because the composition of houses transacted changes. So we can see there was a big boom, a big share in the flats, peaking around about 2007. And there you have it. Acorn categories are a bit more stable, but you can see there's a big change with the recession. So there's a big change there. So the financially stretched, there was a big impact of the recession on those. So they do change over time. So the transaction shares change over time, and in particular they're affected by the recession. And likewise, there's the weights for habitable rooms. So just to conclude then, so it is possible to construct a stock housing price index using essentially the same methodology as the HPI by extending the number of addresses used or houses to the set of all transactions. So it can be done. If we wanted to focus just on owner-occupied housing, we could do that, but what we'd have to do is we'd need to use the weights from something like the Labour Force Survey or the various national housing surveys, the English Housing Survey and its equivalents in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which would give us the breakdown into owner-occupied housing, because the VOA doesn't have that information. So the VOA doesn't have that information, but we could use the surveys which do have that information. I think we need to look a little bit more detail into social housing and how you value it, and the private rental sector. But as I say, that's something we could do. And there are because when you buy something with a right to buy, there's a little field in the form that you fill in which gives you the market price. So the information is there of what the full market price is. So you could include the full market price of social housing sales, even though the actual transaction price is a bit low, but you would only get it with a lag. And I'll just finish now. Just a little thing I'll say, plug beyond. I'd really say that there's quite a lot of data sets use the addresses as the key field. And one thing that occurred to me is that these should all be combined. You could use the structure of the addresses, and you could use that to combine various different data sets, like the household survey, the labour force survey, and so on, which are all based on addresses. Anyway, I'll finish there, and we'll move over to any questions. Thank you. So start there and there. Well, you were first, actually, because you've been waiting, and then we'll go there. Is that okay?
I'll be very quick, but both presentations I enjoyed enormously. Huw, very quickly, it seems to me that there isn't much of a difference in the time series over time, but there might be lots of really interesting regional differences, and especially this issue that we heard about yesterday where somebody accused a speaker in Newcastle of saying it's not my GDP kind of thing. So if there are lots of regional differences, especially in the areas where there are lots of social housing, that might be incredibly interesting. Robert, can I ask if I just understand your hybrid index? If the hybrid index, is it that you use the kind of you use the rental values to pin down what you think the expected capital gains might be? But if the rental values from the surveys are somehow or other backward looking, you said that they were very backward looking as a matter of survey detail, then you're sort of using a very backward looking measure, if I understand it correctly, to see what the expectations, but maybe I misunderstand what your hybrid measure is. But again, enjoyed both the papers.
I actually had the same question.
Oh, right.
On the regional side, but I'll sort of expand a little bit. I mean, I think I was just sort of thinking more generally about the uses of the stock index. And I guess the really obvious one is looking at the levels differences. It can tell you something more representative about how to sort of value housing wealth, sort of balance sheet type use. Are there any other uses that that this was sort of developed to keep in mind, and beyond the sort of the conjunctural regional thing, which I think is also interesting, as mentioned.
Just to answer that regional thing, I mean, this is just a prototype. So yes, you could roll it. You could do it as a regional index, maybe not at the local authority level, because there's a question. You need enough transactions to make it reliable. But yes, you could certainly do it as a regional level. Absolutely no problem, as the current flow house price index is done. But we just haven't done that yet. Other purposes, I think partly it was just people have always talked about the difference and been aware of this frequency bias, but nobody's ever really managed to say, how big is it? Is it big? Is it small? Does it really matter? And we're just lucky being in Britain that we have the data that we can actually answer that question. So I think there's a bit of intellectual curiosity in it, which I think is quite important. And certainly when I started off, we didn't know what the answer was.
Thanks. Just a short question for Professor Hill. I was very interested on the idea of the owner cost. One of the components there you mentioned was the inflation rate. This is then going into the CPI, which is being used to calculate the inflation rate. If you could just simply walk me through any interdependencies in there. Thanks.
Well, can I just reply to both the comments? So take that first one. Yes, there is a potential circularity there, but I mean, I guess what we're doing is just taking for expected inflation the midpoint of the. I mean, in Australia they say between 2% and 3%. So we took the midpoint 2.5%, and actual inflation over that period stayed pretty close to 2.6%. So. But I agree that there is that potential problem with the user cost approach there. That yes, if you need, I mean, in a sense, what you're wanting is the real interest rate. So you take the nominal rate minus the expected rate of inflation. So if you have some other way to get the real interest rate, then that's another possibility. But anyway, our preferred method is this user cost break-even thing, which would bypass that issue. And that brings me to the other point that, if you don't have enough confidence in the rental equivalence data, then we'd say go then to that U0 method where you take user cost and exclude capital gains. But I mean, what we're saying is that, just to repeat, you're basically then just taking the rental equivalence expenditure shares, but instead of using a rental index, you're using a house price index. Is the actual method. But if you don't think the rental series is good enough, and there is that question, but I mean the question mark in the US is not so much the expenditure shares; it's the rental price index that is more of a problem in America with the CPI. So it's not so much a concern about the expenditure shares. Thanks.
And there's a last question from Martin.
Robert, I had a question about your account. I had a question about your account of the net acquisitions approach, although that was obviously tangential to your paper. You seem to be looking at total acquisitions of housing, but we've already got the rental sector in the price index, so shouldn't we be looking only at acquisitions by the owner-occupied sector? And then, if you think of Britain's experience, I don't actually know how general that's been, net acquisitions by the owner-occupied sector have been negative for the last 15 years. And then you get into the ONS having to explain that the housing price index or the CPI has gone down because house prices have gone up, but net acquisitions are negative. Now, Eurostat never provided an explanation of what you do when net acquisitions are negative, but it's actually been happening. We've been living it.
I hadn't really thought about that. I'd like to talk with you about that afterwards. Yeah, thanks.
A very, very last question.
Nick Vaughan, ONS. Thank you very much for two really interesting papers and topics that are sort of close to my heart, and a bit like Martin, spent a lot of time thinking about these. Got two observations and sort of one question perhaps for the floor. So modelling house prices, we used to have a sort of user cost approach in the Treasury, and in that you have a sort of anticipated capital gain, and you can set your window on your backwards-looking sort of expectations. That's quite useful. I think, just for comment, I think Eurostat are going to opine sometime this year about net acquisitions and where they've got to with that. Well, my question for the floor, which neatly links both papers, in rental equivalence, we did have a bit of a debate. Do you use the stock or the flow of new rents? So in the UK, we're really fortunate to have, exhaustive rental data, and, we can mix adjust from sort of rental to owner-occupiers. But we've kind of gone with the flow. So it's the flow of new rents, making sure that they're comparable. But then we actually thought, should this be stock weighted rather than the sort of just the flow? So I thought I'd be interested in views on that, because it's not very obvious to me.
I think it should be stock weighted myself, because in a sense you're reflecting what the actual prices paid by people are. It's the same like you could look at the CPI and you could just look at the prices that have changed in a month and forget all the prices that have remained the same. You wouldn't want to do that because the reality of the consumer price index is the prices which people face. And I think you could have a consumer price index which just looked at the prices which have changed that month, and that's how you value every price. But you don't do that for the CPI, and I don't see any reason why you should have a different approach to the rental thing, except where you have rent controls and there are various other things which are market distortions, which might make the rental market long, rents that are 100 years old or something.
I fear I might have misled you. It's properly stock weighted, so stock our own occupiers.
Yes.
But we've got the sort of flow of new rents. But arguably, if we want to sort of per period owner-occupied housing, even if my rent hasn't changed, I should be using, you see what I mean, the existing rent. You see what I mean? Whereas actually, we look at the rents that have changed, construct sort of inflation in rents.
I mean, my view would be you should only use for new rental contracts only. Forget about people who are existing renters, and just if you want to look at the market, what's happening in the market, you should focus only on new rental contracts.
Well, we started 5 minutes late, so should we finish 5 minutes late? And we're more or less on time, apart from the... Thank you very much, everyone. It's very interesting, it's one of my main interest is actually monetary policy. Oh, right. So this issue of owner-occupied housing is quite interesting.
Do you have a paper, by the way?
All right. Welcome to the second plenary of this conference on economic measurement. We're very, very lucky to have Huw Varian here to speak to us today. He doesn't need much of an introduction. Chief economist at Google, professor at Berkeley. He has a very long list of honors, awards, achievements to his name. He has taught many of us the foundations of economic theory, if not at Stanford or Oxford or MIT, to name some of many places, then through the very clear exposition in his textbooks. And over the last 20 years or so, I think he's been thinking a lot about and doing a lot of work on the digital economy. So without further ado, thank you very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm awed being in a room with so many experts on national accounting. As you will see, I'm a bit of an amateur in this area, but I have looked into technology quite intensively for the last 20 years, and so maybe we can have a useful conversation about some of the challenges that technology is offering to national accounting and how things might evolve in the future. But this is all very tentative, and I encourage you to agree or disagree as you choose. I want to talk about measurement challenges in high tech. I once called this a view from a valley, but then somebody said, well, view from a valley is not very good. So maybe we'll do silicon and statistics as the subtitle. So I'm going to talk a bit about GDP and standard of living or welfare measures. We heard about this from Eric and others yesterday. A little bit about free. I like to say GDP has a hard time with free. And non-market transactions, quality measurements, and global supply chain issues, because I think these are at the forefront of at least my understanding of what's going on in terms of challenges from high tech to national income accounting. So everybody agrees, especially in this room. We all know that GDP is not a measure of welfare, but nobody else seems to know that. And in fact, if you go to Google and you type in GDP and welfare, GDP and standard of living, or words of this effect, you find thousands and thousands of references in the popular press about how GDP is a measure of standard of living, it is said. Productivity and learning standards, measuring living standards with GDP per capita, and so on and so on and so on. Even though way back in 1934, Kuznets was quite clear that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. So as I said, this is commonly accepted by economists and well known to practitioners, but there is a great deal of confusion out there. And if you try to use GDP as a welfare measure, you immediately run into some problems. So GDP is value at market prices of all final goods and services produced in a given country in a given time period. And if you look at all those bold-faced terms, you see some of the problems I'm referring to. Market prices, we don't measure any non-marketed goods really, such as leisure or household production, free goods, quality improvements, in most cases at least. Lots of consumption from durables is not correctly accounted for in the sense they should be, housing being an exception. Final means we exclude intermediate goods, marketing spend, and various kinds of intangibles like design and trade secrets and all sorts of practices that are very important. Produced, well, welfare depends on consumption, not on production. We don't necessarily care about what's being produced, but what's being consumed when we look at welfare. And finally, we have this great deal of complexities introduced by global supply chains because the location of production may not be clear. And sometimes that's conceptual, and sometimes it turns out to be just difficulty in acquiring the necessary numbers. So I'll say just one quick word about free content and services. There's been some work on ad-supported services and what you might call really free content. Advertising is counted as an immediate good in GDP. doesn't show up directly, but this is not a new problem. Radio, TV, magazines, all of these advertiser-supported content had this issue. Nakamura, Samuels, and Soloveitchik have worked on this and have proposed some alternative measures, alternative ways to treat ad-supported content. But by the time you get to the end of those papers, you find out it really doesn't make much difference because aggregate expenditure on advertising really has changed very, very little. It's simply moved from one form of content to the other. In fact, aggregate spend on advertising has been about 1.3% of GDP for the last 100 years, which is a pretty remarkable statistics. So I think you can debate exactly how you want to treat ad-supported content, but it's not going to make any dramatic changes in the aggregate numbers. Of course, there's also what you might call the really free content, things like Wikipedia, which I think shows up at about 15% of search results. It's really a huge availability of content there. Blogs and FRED, like the Federal Reserve Economic Database, photo archives, docs, government publications. The work that you are doing is really free in the sense that people can access it, and of course it's extremely valuable. So here we see publication costs have fallen to near zero, and if there's no price, it's not in GDP, even though it's highly valuable. So one could try to look at some of this truly free content and figure out how to value that, but I don't think this is, again, at the top of the list in terms of how you want to improve GDP, or alternatively, how you want to improve measures of welfare. And that brings me quickly to quality measures. I guess, Eric, did you mention this point yesterday? You used the same example. Okay. Well, back in
with the citations you used.
Yes. Okay. That's good. That's good. 80 billion photos back in 2000. Why do we know that? We know that because there were only 3 companies that made film, so it was pretty easy to count the global production of photos. In 2015, there were 1.6 trillion photos, 20 times as many. And people ask, well, how did you measure that? So I'll tell you my little technique. What I did is I ran a survey. We have a survey tool, and I said, what's your favorite photo archive? And I listed Flickr and Google Photos and iPhotos and all these different choices. And then I went and talked to the Google Photos guys. I said, how many photos are uploaded to Google? So now I had the fraction in terms of Google was of the market, and I also had the number for Google, so you could extrapolate, and you got about 1.6 trillion in 2015. So I thought that was a very clever way to do it. But turns out, of course, it's growing so rapidly. It's probably, I would guess, 2 or 3 times that, maybe more today. The price per photo has gone from about 50 cents a photo from terms of film and developing to essentially zero for all practical purposes. Now, the price index for photography, believe it or not, when you go look at the BLS statistics, it includes the price of film, developing, and cameras, none of which are used anymore to the first degree of approximation. And photos, indeed, are rarely sold. There is a commercial market in photos, of course, but primarily they're shared. So they have a price of zero as well as a cost of zero. And if you think about it, GDP probably went down when cameras went into smartphones, since people stopped buying cameras. So they certainly stopped buying the developing and film services. And at least in the US, there really isn't a meaningful quality adjustment in smartphones at this time. So if you think about consumer surplus, and this is my very rough back of the envelope calculation, let's take the 80 billion photos in 2000 at a cost of 50 cents a piece. There's $40 billion on photography. 1.6 trillion photos produced in 2015. Well, if all of those incremental photos were worth nothing at all that happened was consumers saved $40 billion on the cost of the photos they would have taken anyway. And if those incremental photos were really worth 50 cents, that is the same value as the marginal photo was worth in 2000, then they would have gained nearly $1 trillion. which of course both of those numbers are pretty unreasonable because we don't really know what that demand function looks like. Well, now we do actually, because Eric has worked on this question, but you'd like to look at the value of the incremental photo and use that to value the entire production. At one time, that incremental cost was 50 cents. Now it's essentially zero. So we certainly don't need to economize on taking photos. There are many, many, many photos produced. And neither of those numbers shows up in GDP since, as I said, the price of a marginal photo is effectively zero these days. Here's a picture of what camera production looks like. So the gray line is traditional cameras, the blue lines are digital cameras, and then right at the end there you see the digital cameras dropping off precipitously because everybody has their smartphone with them all the time, and all the photos, the large fraction of photos taken today are taken using a digital phone rather than a traditional camera. And this is what the BLS expenditure data looks like for photos. 30% of the population of the households in 1990 reported that they were buying film. Now it's less than 0.5%. So it's a huge, huge change in just a relatively short time. And the spend per household on processing film and so on has gone down by a factor of 10. It's 1/10 of what it was, but you can be sure the number of photos taken is much, much larger. And by the way, that's true for other things as well. If you look at vehicular monitoring systems for trucking, back in the 1990s, the price was over $1,000 to have a GPS system, and it showed up in productivity. I mean, there we really saw trucking became much more productive. It's easy to measure productivity in trucking. It's just, are you carrying something or are you not, effectively? And we saw productivity growth being about twice as high as aggregate productivity growth. And of course, then the price became cheaper, and households started to buy them. It became cheaper and cheaper. Well, as that price became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, real GDP went up, 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 right until the price hit zero, and now it's no longer in GDP. It went out of GDP at that point because it had a zero price. So it is a kind of funny discontinuity. The cheaper you make a product, the more you add to real GDP until the product disappears entirely when the camera is absorbed into smartphones. And I think Eric might have mentioned this list as well. If you think about a mobile phone, it's a substitute for a camera, a GPS, a landline, a game machine, an e-book reader, a computer. You go on and on and on. And think about it. All of the demand for those substitute products has been dramatically reduced, suggesting that the smartphone's impact on GDP to a large extent was reducing GDP because you were producing less of all those products and you weren't really accounting for it in any way when they were incorporated into this mega product, the smartphone. So, as I said, price of a product goes down, real GDP goes up, price hits zero, then it's no longer GDP. So there's no quality improvement in GDP for these smartphones, right? Because it's already at a price of zero, or the components, I should say, the components of the smartphones. Yet we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on teams of engineers doing all sorts of great, cool things with the phones, since they're a big component of why people might start with the cameras in the phones, because they're one of the reasons that people might choose one phone over another. So people love their smartphones. The New York Times ran a survey saying if you could take some bit of modern technology back to 1964, what would you take? Well, of course, you would take your smartphone. Of course, there wouldn't be a network, but even so, I thought it was indicative just how important those devices have become because of all the all the services they can offer, and yet the welfare measurement is certainly iffy, and even the GDP measurement has a few problems, as you'll see in a second. Where is an iPhone made, right? Well, in Cupertino, they do all of the software, all the design, the software, the marketing, the branding, all these things. And in Shenzhen is where the phone is actually assembled. So the Apple folks in Cupertino send the plans and the software to Shenzhen, and then they put together a phone. They have parts from 28 countries and 766 suppliers. And one thing that's interesting about this list is the supplies could come from U.S. companies. Well, many of them are from U.S. companies, but they could be manufactured various places in the world. So the screen made by Corning could be provided from Kentucky, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. Processors designed by Apple could be made by Samsung in Korea or also in Taiwan. Cellular modem comes from Qualcomm in San Diego. Could be fabbed in Germany, Singapore, New York, Vermont. They have production facilities in all those places, and so on and so on. So you have this issue of the screen, the processor, the cellular modem. It doesn't make any difference where it's made. It's identical product, but if it's fabbed in one place and not another, then it's going to show up in international GDP accounts at least differently. And I would say, I guess, as a Silicon Valley person, well, what really matters is where that chip was designed, whether it was designed in San Diego or where the screen was invented or the recipe was perfected, which would be in New York with Corning, and the actual physical construction is a secondary issue. Now, I realize this is a debatable point, but maybe it's something we can discuss a little later on. Wonderful article called The All-American iPhone, which you can find online, where these statistics come from. And the next one, I have to say, it's just so wild and crazy. Do you recognize that? That's a periodic table of the elements, which you may remember from high school chemistry. And it shows all the elements that are in an iPhone. And as this author says, no tech product from mine to assembly can ever be made in one country because you don't have the raw materials to make it in a single country. And so by construction, it has to be a global product to get all of the different materials that you need to create an iPhone, or for that matter, any mobile phone. So GDP is about what's produced in a given country, but today the locus of production is far from obvious in many cases. And how do you disentangle the global supply chain? And just as a little background why this is an important thing to do, in 2015 there were about $400 billion worth of smartphones shipped. I don't know what the current number is, but it's certainly would be at least 600 billion, I would imagine, although prices are coming down. We have a $60 mobile phone available in India, and I would anticipate lower prices in the future. But even so, 400 billion, that's a significant number. Now, I put this little dangerous curves ahead sign in here because I do want to talk about some of the details of national income and accounting, and usually I have to apologize for that. But in this audience, at least, I know that you'll all be awake and alert during the next 5 or 10 minutes. And this, I should say, is my understanding, so feel free to correct me on some of these things. The documentation is not as clear as I would like it to be. So GDP, of course, now measures software. We count at the cost of production. We count embedded software that is embedded into a mechanical device as an intermediate product to avoid double counting. So back in 2013, life was simple. If you looked at the cost to develop the Android operating system, that was done in Mountain View, and that was viewed as an investment. And we owned a company, Motorola, that installed the operating system on its smartphones, which were actually assembled in Texas, believe it or not. The phone is sold for $500 in the US, so the sale of that phone counts in GDP. It's mostly made in the US it's all made in the US in the sense of assembly and software preparation, and many of the parts were made in the US, but that would show up in the ones that weren't showed up as imports. So everything looks great. The software is already included as an intermediate product, and so on. But then the world changed because now the software is all made in the US, but we sold the Motorola factory to Lenovo, and so now what happens is many of the phones are assembled in China or Korea or elsewhere in the East, East Asia. Part of the value of the phone is domestic, the software, and I would argue the biggest part is the value of the software, because that's where all the competition is occurring. But all the physical phones are actually assembled outside the US. And the question is, how do you value this software-hardware split? It's like, how do you value the left shoes and the right shoes? It's quite tricky. So I go through in this little accounting exercise, I go through how what the numbers look like. And these are roughly accurate numbers for an iPhone SE. Costs about $150 parts and labor to assemble in China. $5 worth of labor is the usual number used. Sells for about $400 in the US. And then what they do in the Bureau of Economic Statistics is they look at the difference between this $150 and the $400, and they call that the wholesale margin. Now I say down here, that's kind of a hack. You know, a hack in MIT terminology means something that, yeah, it gets you to the right answer, but it's not necessarily the right way to get there, because we all know it's not really the wholesale margin that's driving the value of the phone, it's the design and the software. And the better way, in my opinion, is to look at the actual production of the software and treat it as an export, or look at the manufacturing of the part and treat that as an import. And there have been various proposals to do exactly that. So, for example, if you look at the 2008 System of National Accounts, Apple sends the design and software to China. The manufacturing services are imported from China. Okay, that's the convention. Phones purchased in the US, we get down to this net change in GDP of being $250. The value of the phone, $400. The value of the imported services from China, and you end up getting the same number as in the last slide, but it's a little bit more logical in terms of how it's treated. Now, this is an example of what's known as factoryless goods producers. It's hard to say those words, I must say. Lots of products are designed in the US and assembled in China, and this is true globally. There are products designed in Germany and assembled in Poland or the Czech Republic or wherever. Particularly true for consumer electronics and software. It's much, much easier to count a physical product coming in through the port of Los Angeles than it is to count an email attachment going the other direction, right? And a lot of that design and a lot of the value and a lot of the costly aspects of creating the phone is in fact in that software and design, these intangibles. So is the email attachment an export? Is it a non-market transaction inside the firm? Does it matter where you put the software and hardware together? You could imagine adding the software to the hardware in California, ship the phones there, flash on the software, go out and sell them. You could put it on a boat going across the Pacific. You could do the final assembly by combining the software and hardware and so on. And this is an example, of course, of how do you deal with these intangible components of production, which are more and more important. There's a nice new book by Haskell and Westlake that looks at this, this question, because more and more of the economy is intangible. Factoryless goods producers. So as I mentioned, the U.S., or I didn't mention, but the U.S. did consider switching to using the factoryless goods producers as a concept. So you look at that then as importing manufacturing services, but they got 22,000 complaints from labor unions and small manufacturers saying that this was an attempt to hide the manufacturing crisis in the U.S., and finally, the OMB just kind of gave up and kicked the can down the road. And maybe at some time in the future, they may move towards such a system, but it's definitely off the table for now. And I believe other countries have moved to the 2008 SNAs where they do count the factoryless goods producers. Maybe you can enlighten me on that point. Okay, this is how I think it should be done. I think you should count the export of the design and software as an export, The phone is assembled in China, the phone's imported into the US, so contributes negatively to GDP because it's an import, it's purchased in the US, and then the contribution to US GDP is $250, just like it was on all the other slides. They always come out to the same amount. It's a question of how you get there and why it might make a difference. Well, the reason it might make a difference, oh, by the way, you could do the same thing with the 2008 SNA of counting the imported manufacturing services. You still end up at the same point by doing it. Now, the question is, why does it make a difference? Well, I think if you do it this way, then it's going to work much better for phones that are exported from China, the final port of assembly, to some other country. Because really, when you're exporting that $400 phone, $250 of that value is made in the US, and if you count it as a US export, that's going to show up in US trade statistics and GDP. So that's my opinion, at least. You, again, get down to the same number, but now it's not the fact that the $250 shows up in the, it shows up in the domestic GDP for a different reason, because it's counting as an export of this intangible, the software and design, to another country. So Android phones, well, so that's the, at least my view of what that market should look like. Now, there's further complications. If you look at iPhone, it's an internal product. It only goes on Apple's iPhones. Android, on the other hand, is externally available to everybody, but they don't buy it. You see, there's the trouble. It's not a market transaction. It's actually a barter transaction, because the deal is, if you use the Android operating system, which you get absolutely for free, then the only requirement is you have to put a folder of Google apps on the home screen of your phone. You can put other apps on the phone as well, but you have to have those Google apps there in order to complete your part of the barter transaction. Now, I have to say, this is somewhat controversial in the European Commission, and that is being hashed out now in the courts. But if you look at barter transactions, they are supposed to show up in GDP, and this is a biggie because this is hundreds of billions of dollars of barter transactions here, far larger than anything else I'm aware of. And what does that mean? It means you have to value or one choice at least is to value that software at zero. Now really this is a business model issue, because we expect to recover part of that cost of developing the system by the fact that people are going to use Google and click on ads and do all these other things. So the business transaction makes sense from a private profitability point of view, but I think it's a bit of a struggle for GDP accounting to treat it appropriately. And if you looked at the quality adjustment, I was complaining earlier, the quality adjustment for smartphones isn't really there, but even if it could be there, even if we made it, well, if it shows up primarily as an import, then it's not going to show up in GDP anywhere, right? And most of the quality adjustment in reality is on the software side, but the software is then given away in exchange for this barter transaction. So it gets to be very tricky from the viewpoint of how that goes into GDP, and it's important because if you look at that $400 billion worth of trade in mobile phones, and you think maybe half of that, I think that's an underestimate, but let's say half of that is in the value of the software, well, that cuts the US trade deficit in half. If you counted that as an export, then you'd have a very different picture of what the trade deficit looked like in the US. And the BEA, I have to say, they recognize and they agree that it's very hard to count these things. The physical product's easy, the intangibles going the other direction are hard, and maybe you could miss some value there. So I think that it's recognized as a problem, but people just have not agreed on the solution, and not only not agreed on the solution, but then just finding the numbers, imputing the numbers. How do you build this kind of unusual structure into GDP accounting. And by the way, it's all the other gadgets too. It's not just the smartphones. It's the Amazon Echo and the Google Home, and everything else has this same structure. And in fact, if you look at average household spend, huge amount of parts on vehicles are manufactured elsewhere. Well, that's fine. We can look at value added. But the interesting thing is the design of those vehicles is still done in the country where the usually where the company considers home. So the BMWs and Mercedes and so on. There's a huge value to the design that's conducted in Germany, even though the car may end up being assembled in Czechoslovakia with parts from Poland. Consumer electronics, $1,600 spend by the average household. Same thing, TVs and so on can be designed here, manufactured elsewhere. Furniture, toys, very big deal. Clothes, very big deal. The Gap designs a new sweater or a hoodie or some new colors or design. That's where the value comes from, because the clothes are assembled in Turkey for 1/10 of the price of the final goods. Autos, there's a Mustang, I just saw these numbers. A windshield is made in Japan, the dashboard is made in France, the seats are made in Germany. The bumper for a Ford Focus is made in Canada, seatbelts in Sweden. You know, it's just, everything is global now. And we just went to a very nice talk talking about value added for these kinds of global production chains. And indeed, the OECD and other people have tried to do that, but when you throw intangibles into the picture, it's going to get even more difficult. And finally, we have yet another challenge. The IP, the country where the IP is held, may be relevant. So we know the best performing economy in the world back in 2015 was Ireland, 26% increase in GDP, primarily showing up in the investment and export numbers, but of course nobody really believes that number, because it's a case where they're imputing the products to the country where the company resides, rather than where the economic value is really created, which could be quite different. And it's the same thing if we go look at Apple or Android or any of these other things. That issue shows up as well, since a lot of the intellectual property, at least until is currently held in various sorts of offshore entities. That's going to change because of the new tax law in the U.S. We're going to see fairly large changes in those practices, but it'll take some time to get that figured out as well, in terms of whether you're really attributing production to the right place. So I'm going to say one last bit about semiconductors, something also quite important to our hearts in Silicon Valley. It is Silicon Valley, after all. In the 90s, we saw this rapid decline in semiconductor quality adjusted prices, and then after that it slowed down. I'll show you a chart in a minute. This is important because virtually all of the productivity improvement in manufacturing in the 90s was due to that quality adjustment for semiconductors. And this has been pointed out by many people, that this seems to distort the overall productivity measurements for manufacturing because of this huge change in semiconductors, which was primarily due to the fact that the quality adjustment was primarily due to Moore's law, because Moore's law was increasing the power of these transistors very rapidly. And this nice paper by Byrne, Oliner, and Sitchell looks at the change in pricing practices by Intel, and they look at multi-core CPUs. So we did hit a barrier with semiconductors in the last 6 or 7 years because of heat dissipation problems. So instead of trying to make them faster, they moved to doing multi-core on the same chip. So that was nice because it was better for the viewpoint of heat dissipation. It meant nothing at all to most of our work on the desktops, but it's a big deal for the data centers, because if you have an 8-core chip, maybe on that single chip you can run, it's equivalent to, let's say, 6 separate chips And that was a huge help because it reduced the cost of operation of the data center, reduced the cost of capital for the data center. So it's been a big plus there. And also there's been a huge amount of work in trying to reduce power consumption, because the biggest variable cost for a data center, and of course it's the biggest annoyance with your smartphone because it always runs out of the battery just when you want to use it for something important. So the goals of making the chips have changed dramatically since the 90s. In the 90s, everybody was after higher clock speeds and more processing, but now multi-cores are what's important for the data centers, and energy use is what's important as well for both the data centers and for all these portable devices. And finally, the last point that's important to make is that CPUs, that's so 90s. Everybody is into GPUs and TPUs. So what are GPUs? That's a graphical processing unit, which turns out to have a excellent design for doing certain sorts of machine learning calculations. And the TPUs, or tensor processing units, are special purpose chips that are adapted specifically to certain kinds of machine learning and artificial intelligence application. So we're going to see a renaissance, really, in these special purpose chips, where you have TPUs in the data centers. Okay, that's already there. But you'll have TPUs on your phones and other devices that you use that are optimized for specific machine learning tasks. So it used to be central processor, completely standardized product. Everything was done in software. Now it's moving to a new world where the TPUs and the GPUs are optimized for certain tasks, and the chip designers are now very pleased because they're relevant again. This, by the way, is the picture of the real value added. You can see the computers and electronic products had this huge outlier. I mentioned that earlier. This is the picture from the Nolinder and Sichel paper, where clock speed, the red line there, basically plateaued back in the early 2000s, hasn't changed, but the throughput rate, because of those additional cores, that has continued to grow at an exponential rate. Notice it's a logarithmic axis there, so the straight lines are, in fact, exponential. So, GDP has big problems with free. Is a measurable problem than it used to be? This is the question. Yes, we've always mismeasured things. Is it worse now? My answer is a solid perhaps. Why? Because a global value chain, that's really dramatically changed in the last 20 years. A lot of the unmeasured quality changes have accumulated for all these electronic devices, and our definition of quality has changed, because what used to just be simple clock speed is now something quite different. According to Byrne and Corrado here, the ICT technological change potentially contributes as much as 1.4% percentage points per year to labor productivity. So that's a pretty large number, but I think it could easily be true. And I think also we need to think more broadly about the kinds of economic statistics that we are marketing to the public. We all know GDP is not a measure of welfare, but there's a desperate cry out there that we want a measure of welfare, and so we ought to devote, I think, more effort to doing it. Again, Eric has worked on this, and many other people. I think you want to use domestic consumption as your measure, obviously, using imputed prices for some of these free goods, and then put more attention on to quality adjustment. Those are all very simple things to say, but as we know, they're much more difficult to actually implement. And I'm happy to see this large group thinking about these very important issues. So thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions. We have some roving mics here. Here's a question over here. She's right behind you.
Thank you very much. I find language is a barrier to understanding these things sometimes. If you accept that design is basically an idea, is it right to say you export an idea?
Right.
Isn't an idea shared? Once you've created it, the thing has a life of its own. It exists around the world. And this is why we get these location issues when companies, for possibly, I don't know, corporation, tax, fiscal engineering reasons, end up having GDP in Ireland by having such a ludicrous increase. I'd make a similar point on intangibles. To me, software is an access to the algorithm which lies behind. So I'm really not keen on this expression, intangibles. I like things to be either ideas or things you can use to access the ideas. And I would argue that software is such an access device. Just as a book is access to a story, software is an access to the algorithm. Thank you.
Yes, so excellent point. Let me do a thought experiment from your undergraduate economics course. And I should say mea culpa here, because I described the traditional model of production in economics is you say, well, if you have these factors, you can produce this much output. Okay, so you list the factors. You've got this much labor, this much capital, this much of this much of that. It's kind of like cooking. If I want to make a souffle, I need this many eggs, I need this much flour, I need this much butter, and this much cheese. And so if I lay all these products out on the counter, there's one thing missing. The recipe. I don't have the recipe. So if I wanted to build a new plant to produce cars, it's the same way. You could acquire all these different pieces of equipment and all these different raw materials, but then how do you actually assemble them to produce something that's valuable? I would say the recipe is one of the most critical parts, and that recipe is designed and improved over time, and people are paid a lot of money to create that recipe. If we want GDP to equal gross national income, well, then we're going to have to count the payments that you're paying to people to create the ideas in terms of design and these other intangibles, the software. We need to count their payment in there in some sense as well. And it's not just on the investment side. See, I've created this software, this intellectual property, shows up as investment in the national accounts, as it should. But that investment has a payoff, namely the fact that I invested all this time in creating the software means that each phone that software is flashed onto has now become a lot more valuable because it can actually perform some functions. So to me, I think that I would believe that these intangibles are real products, even though they have the unique characteristics you described, that once you've created them, you can create copies at essentially zero marginal cost. Absolutely fair, absolutely true, but that's where most of the product improvements are coming from. So if we leave that part out, we've left out a big part of the modern economy. Diane. Oh, here's the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk, as ever. And you've got a room full of people here interested in improving economic statistics. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you think is most important. Mm-hmm. Would you rather see better GDP or a better measure of economic welfare for that public conversation you were just referring to? Or would you rather see the focus be on the trade statistics because of the policy consequences of that?
Right. Well, maybe the most dangerous are the trade statistics in the sense that they could be used to justify or to argue for policies which are, I think, perverse, in my opinion. So that might be the highest priority of understanding how that works better. Although I will say it's a big challenge just to do real value-added statistics, much less putting in the intangibles of just how we handle that. So it is a challenging problem as well. I also think that goes part and parcel with improving GDP measurements, because so much of the domestic product is not necessarily fully integrated with this global view of economic activity. So that would be my second priority. Then I have to say the third priority would be in the welfare measurement, because there is a crying need for that, but that's going to be a conversation. And my kind of imperfect vision would be to think about these statistics, these aggregate statistics, as kind of a Lego set. or we have this baseline as traditional GDP, and here we're going to make some adjustments by adding in imports and subtracting out somewhere else, and here's another column, we make another set of adjustments. And so we don't want to think of one single figure as really describing the entire economy. We might think of different figures being used for different purposes. Now, there are limits of how you could multiply these different figures, but I think it would be attractive to have a model like that.
No, thinking of the, Martin Wheel, thinking of the example you gave of photographs and so on, I didn't pay enough attention to your numbers and so on, and was trying to work out what the compound rate of growth of photos was each year. If it was, say, doubling each year over 10 years, you'd get 1,000 times increase. Maybe that was the sort of number you had. If I spent 0.3% of my consumption on photographs, having photographs printed and so on, when you had to pay for them, that is grossed up in terms of overall welfare. It's an interesting number, but it doesn't seem actually to be terribly large.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was only one thing. And there's the GPS. We can do that. We can do the music device. We can go on and on and on. And it's a similar calculation. So each one of those products could be a few percent. But then when you gross them all up, I think you get a pretty big number.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. The photos also, Kodak used to run they had a study where they claimed that people would go into a burning house for 3 reasons: to save a family member, to save a pet, or to save the photo album. And of course, this seems very strange to us now, because your photo album, if you're smart, is sitting up there in the cloud somewhere, impervious to pretty much any natural disaster. So people are, I believe, getting a great deal of value out of sharing and trading and using these photos. Yes.
Can I just
go
mention one thing? Are you getting any questions from outside? No, not at the moment.
No,
okay.
That's because it was such a clear talk.
We have Nick Bloom over here.
So I thought it was very interesting. I was going to make a point on a number, which is in the MBR, there's a session every year, CRIW, that Carol and I and others organise. Last summer, there was a paper that was very related to this, which was by Kimbrel, Fatih Guven, and some people at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is very much on your point, which is they were trying to estimate the lost GDP to the US from American products made abroad and sold abroad. So if they make an iPhone, as your example, if you make an iPhone in China and sell it in the UK, none of that revenue is, almost none of it's booked to US GDP. So they went back and they estimated that the lost GDP in the US per year is up to about 0.5% a year. My guess is for the UK, it's not quite as extreme. And the other point is a lot of that never shows up anywhere else, because it turns out where the profits are booked, for example, Bermuda, typically ignores it. So the GDP doesn't show up anywhere. But the other issue is for the UK, again, because it's relatively high tax rate compared to some of these tax havens, I suspect it's missing. I mean, I don't know exactly how it's done, but for the UK, the BA was seriously considering redoing some of these accounts. And the numbers were really large because of the amount of tax pushed offshore. Of course, that's going to come back down again, but it was gone from it affects not only levels but growth rates, because these levels were close to zero that was offshore in the 80s.
Yep. Well, I think there are 2 separate issues there. One is where the economic activity takes place and where the profits are booked. And even if you were exactly right about where the economic activity occurs, namely the code for the iPhone is written in Cupertino, California, then you still have the additional question of, well, where's that intellectual property really held from an accounting point of view? And then that gives you the separate set of issues. So I think the second one is fixable. And in fact, because of the changes in the US tax law, it's going to get, the numbers are going to become more realistic, I think. But then you still have the second issue of where's the value created? You know, the left shoe's made here, the right shoe's made here. The hardware's made here, the software made here. It's really only combining the two. And does it matter where they're combined? You know, it's kind of funny, because if you think about bringing the phones into the US and then flashing the operating system on them. So now that value is clearly created in the US because the investment in software is made in the US and the, adding it to the smartphone. It's no different than adding a chip. A chip is just frozen software, as the designers say. But what if you had a really, really long cable that went all the way from Cupertino to China and then flashed it over that long cable rather than the short cable? What's the difference?
Eric, you have a...
Thanks, Huw. You pointed out some really interesting challenges to the economic statistics and things we could do better on. There's also a whole set of tools that Google and a lot of others have helped create. There's a lot more data available, the Internet of Things. These mobile phones track all sorts of information about where people are, who they're communicating with. So in principle, we have, orders of magnitude more data to keep track of what's happening in the economy. What are your thoughts about some of the opportunities or the so far unexplored opportunities to use some of the newly available digital data to get a better view of the economy?
So one interesting example is looking at inputs for doing hedonic adjustments. So we've got all these characteristics of the phones, and each year they're getting better and better because they have higher resolution cameras or better software services and so on. And in order to do the econometric exercise of trying to adjust for that, those characteristics, what you need to do is you need all the data about all the phones, all the characteristics, and which bundles of services are attractive to people. So Amazon has already compiled all that data, and Google has that data, and other people have acquired that data, and so that's one place where you could utilize a lot of already compiled data for doing these government quality adjustments to products. And is that true? That's true for everything, for also, especially consumer electronics, that you can get, many companies are in the business of organizing, compiling consumer data so we can get a viewpoint of that consumer data that's much, much more accurate and detailed than what was available previously. So that's one example.
I think we have a question from outside.
Okay. So the question is about the realism of the 0 pence or 0 cents on the cost of photographs. Thinking about, are we substituting one cost for another? The cost of a phone with a better camera is higher, including the cost of paid for photo editing software. So do we need to think about substituting one set of costs for another in that equation?
So it's a good question, and I did a little back of the envelope calculation, and in my view, it's still a reasonable approximation for the cost of an incremental photo on a smartphone is pretty much 0. Even though, yes, the phone costs a little more if it has a better camera, and also there is some minor cost in managing that digital image, et cetera, but still the difference between 50 cents a photo and whatever you think photo costs now would be pretty substantial, is my conclusion.
I think we have a couple of questions over here. Kevin.
I guess one other issue is the valuation of those photos. It is ironic, isn't it, that people would rush into the house to get the photo album, yet they'd also use Instagram where the photos disappear in 10 minutes. So you've got a demand on both sides. I want a photo that's a permanent record, and I want a photo that's no record at all. So we can provide those non-incriminating photos just however we want.
Huw, I think your suggestion for doing hedonic adjustments for the quality in smartphones has had some impact because from January this year, the BLS is doing some hedonics for smartphones. I don't know how good it is, but they have started on that, perhaps way overdue.
I know a little bit about that project because I talked to them along the lines I was just describing, but I didn't know it had actually started in January, so it's great to see that happen. Although to really be valuable, you'll need to go back historically, because a lot of the innovations were made over the course of the early days, and now we're seeing incremental improvements. It's interesting, by the way, just as an aside, smartphones, they're like babies. They take 9 months to create. And when you finalize the design for your smartphone, so we're finalizing the design for the smartphones that will be produced not this fall, well, yes, roughly this fall, because everybody produces a product for the Christmas season. We finalize the design, and then it's going to take 9 months to line up the supply chain and the contracts and get everything produced in time for the release. But what's interesting about it is you don't know anything about what the competition is going to look like in 9 months. So you may come out with a really cool feature that captures people's imagination, and then it's great, it's fantastic. Or you may come out with a phone that's just me too. It's just like 6 other phones in the market. So everything is designing the product now, finalizing design, making it available in 9 months, and who knows what competition looks like then.
I actually have a question as well.
All right.
So kind of following up on Eric's point, and I believe in some previous work you looked at time savings.
Oh, yes.
And so this comes to the use of time issue, and that the fact we don't perhaps have very good time use information, which would have changed dramatically with the advent of a lot of these digital goods.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an opportunity cost valuation for a lot of these goods. And I'm wondering if, drawing on this theme of alternative data sources, something like Uber data,
mm-hmm.
we get some idea about the amount of time people spend sitting in traffic.
Yep.
Are there other alternative data sources like that which you think may help understand the valuations of some of these products?
Right. So we have the same sort of data from Google Maps, because when you're getting these driving directions, it tells you how long it expects that you'll take to get from A to B, and I'm always amazed at how accurate that estimate is. You think about all the time we save by not getting lost. I don't know about you, but I used to get lost a lot. Even finding this building is a bit of a challenge, and and now, of course, we don't do that anymore. That's just eliminated. So those smartphones with the GPS systems have had a huge increase on my personal productivity, but that doesn't really show up in GDP because it's not a market transaction. So you can go through example after example. We've reduced or eliminated transactions cost or increased time savings, and it's not valued in any direct way. By the way, I will tell you about the experiment we did run. We were trying to look at the value of Google, the Google service. And so we got a group of students at University of Michigan assembled in the lobby of the library and handed out questions that they should go answer. Half the group answered the questions using Google, and half the group answered the questions using the library. So it turns out it was 22 minutes to answer the average question using the library, and it was 7 minutes to answer the question using Google, and so it was 15 minutes of time saving per question, which is amazing. And we'd already started them out in the library, so they didn't have to do the travel costs. So we tried to be as objective as possible, and we had questions that were questions asked to librarians, research librarians, and also questions that were asked to Google. So we tried to make the questions a fair choice as well, and it's really very substantial amount of time. So I don't care what wage you use to value that 15 minutes per question, but that's a big, big time savings. And I think we all know that, right? I mean, you've got this huge savings of time from having online access. By the way, it's funny because Eric and I wrote similar papers at the same time where you were valuing the time people spent online was good. They were entertained. I was saying, no, that's bad. We want to get the answers as quickly as possible. Well, both are true because they're different kinds of activities.
I'm going to take a question here, and then we've got one over here.
Hi. I'm really struck by your emphasis on trying to capture the value of the intellectual property in national accounts and the challenge of doing this for property that's given away free, perhaps bartered, perhaps provided free of charge by government sectors. I'm trying, however, to get a grip on how much of that is specific to the technological revolution that we'd associate with Silicon Valley, and to what extent this should be applied to the past. So I'm trying to understand, should we think of the discovery of radio and television transmission and incorporate that into this system? Should we think about the introduction of the interstate highway system in the US, international communication standards, going back to the telegraph and the telephone? Should we think about the introduction of a system of laws as intellectual property that generates economic value? I guess the most extreme value is, how do we treat the discovery of fire? and how that adds value to agriculture and all the products of the Industrial Revolution. So I guess my question is twofold. One, how broadly should we be trying to apply this in revaluing national accounts? And how specific is this to, I guess, what I'd loosely call the current age? Thanks.
Well, Bill Nordhaus, for example, has done this for light and for computation, and you've seen people do, if you look at these charts of GDP and what happened during the Industrial Revolution, and so there have been attempts to do this. I think now the right question to ask, or an important question to ask, is can we conceive of the counterfactual? So the counterfactual meaning this innovation didn't occur. So you could imagine that smartphones never came around and what life would be like compared to that world, because many of us can remember that. It's like a mom told me her child said, "Mommy, how did people find each other at airports before there were mobile phones?" And you know, it is, how did we? It's a good question. It's a really good question, because it seems so difficult to do, but yet we managed to do it somehow. So you could do this kind of situations where the counterfactual is viable. You could get an idea of what it looked like. If we go back to what did fire contribute, I think it's going to be a lot harder. Our lives would be phenomenally different if we didn't have some of these inventions. So think about things that we've experienced in our lifetime. That would be my guess about the most practical way to approach that issue.
Jonathan Haskell, enjoyed the talk very much. Can you say a bit more, Hal, about what you were just talking about, the library experiment?
Oh, yeah,
because it seems to me it gets to the heart of you know what a lot of Google is and what a lot of people in this room use it for. Namely, it's a kind of an innovation in the innovation process, if you see what I mean. Now, on the one hand, I mean, all of us in this room would say that's just a fantastic thing to do, and it's revolutionised our research. On the other hand, of course, we don't see that so much in changes in productivity and all of that. So can you just talk about that a little bit and where you see that going and so forth?
Well, it is the big question. With all of this innovation that I've been talking about, why does it show up more in productivity statistics? By the way, the reference on the paper I described is Yan Chen was the primary author. She's at the University of Michigan School of Information, and you can track that down pretty easy. I think it's called A Day Without a Search Engine. So we said, what would a day without a search engine look like? And that was the attempt to answer that. But I do think that part of it is a lot of these savings are showing up in transactions cost sorts of things, getting to the library and doing this research. Now, there is an opportunity cost there that you should be measuring. The GPS system is another example. You had to carry maps around, find a map, fold it back up. That was always a very difficult task. That stuff is gone. So we've removed that kind of frustration and transactions costs now that we used to have. I had a group of people, construction people, do some work on my house last year, and it was remarkable how much they were using their smartphone. they would photograph a picture of a piece of hardware or something that they were going to go by the store, and then they'd go to the store and then have it, or they'd send it to their friend who was at the store, and they used it for doing certain kinds of measurements, for coordinating activity, and for playing the mariachi music when they were working. So it had such, so many different uses that it seemed like it was just an integral part of the production process. Now, you would think that if they were that much more efficient, then they should be able to get more work done or more output produced in a given amount of time. So why that isn't showing up in GDP is something of a mystery to me. Maybe they're consuming more of that as leisure time, right? So they can only schedule a certain number of jobs a day, and maybe they're more efficient. If they reduce the time necessary to do one job, they consume more leisure. I don't know. I think we'll see in the next, as the economy, of course, is much, much tighter now, and we'll see whether these transactions costs the savings in transaction costs gets translated into increased production of product. I think it will. That's my guess if I had to bet, but we'll see that in the next few years. Oh, okay.
Just a very short point/question to declare my interest, and I thought long and hard before I said anything. My name is Jennifer Banham. I work in the CSO in Ireland, and it's just your point there about what happened with the economic statistics and GDP in particular in our 2015 results, and you hit on a lot of the challenges. I mean, that's what we're here around, is the challenges of how we measure the economic statistics and the inversions. You mentioned the pharmaceutical sector as well. And I think it's just for ourselves to think back. I know how when we're measuring the pharmaceutical sector, it was actually behaving quite well in the figures, in that we had heavy exports from that sector attributable to Ireland, but very high imports of royalties that were being paid back through some channel, probably to a US parent. So the value added was kind of reasonable enough. What happened then, of course, is we had relocations of IP. And I hate to drag it back to IP, but for a lot of us, that's where the challenge is at the moment in the compilation. And the residence of the IP. And then the going with that, the change of economic ownership, and then what's attributable to the economy, because that's there. But practically what we saw is, because the IP was located in Ireland, we were no longer paying big royalties back to the parents. So the value added to the Irish economy shot up dramatically because of contract manufacturing, and we had this really disproportionate effect, and people saw it. I know people don't like it, but it did actually reflect what happened within the rules. But what I'm very interested in, Alan, what you're saying, and what everybody has been saying here over the last couple of days, is around, there's an idea we'll attribute the IP back to where the thinking, where the ideas and so on were actually done, where the thinking was done. And I just say, from the point of view of improving the economic statistics, is that will be a really good and interesting discussion, because what we want to do as well, if we do that, we don't want to confuse it even more. I just have nightmares of imputed flows and a kind of a spaghetti junction of something, with things flying here and there, and we won't serve the users they won't get any value from it, and the compilers will lose more hair and more sleep over all these things as well. And just another thing about the measurement, and again, it's just this point about the IP, the challenge of measuring it. People didn't like what happened with the Irish results in 2015, but at least it's measured now. There's an awful lot of this IP that's just not measured, and we don't know where it is, and nobody knows where it is. And I think it's back to an awful lot of the asymmetries discussions that we were having earlier, I think, as well, at the last session. And it's very interesting as a compiler, and you talking about it from an expert, from an industry expert point of view. It's interesting. I think that the challenges, and we all agree, the challenges are the same. So it's just around that challenge around what we do.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's going to become more transparent because of the change in the U.S. Corporate tax law. And you'll see a big chunk happen before July 1st, because there are considerable tax advantages for companies that use a non-annual accounting mechanism to get it done earlier rather than later. And then the companies that use the calendar year accounting, that's going to be a little delayed. But the situation will be quite chaotic in that dimension for the next year. So any data you look at will not really be finalized for a year, essentially. And then, of course, there could be ordinary changes, just the costs of repatriation are much less, repatriating the intellectual property. By the way, the intellectual property that we think about are patents and copyright and brands and this kind of stuff, but the trade secrets are just practices, I want to say. They're not even secrets. It's just the way things get done. Those are by far the biggest number in terms of what happens. And those typically, there is a market for them. It's called the labor market. And so when we see these large premia being paid to people who can do deep learning or who can deal with autonomous vehicles, that is showing up as a payment in part for the intellectual property. I think you want to put that in quotes. The knowledge would be a better term that people have embedded by working at a company.
Is this working? Yeah, Will Page at Spotify. I wanted to connect two earlier questions. One, my colleague from Australia who talked about time savings, and two, Jonathan Haskell, who talked about productivity. And on the first point, I think the time saving is a huge element. I'm not even sure if it's the job of economists to try and capture it, but we can try. I also think there's a cost of living effect as well. Anecdotally, people from London who are moving out of London because technology allows them to come in when they need to, but live in the countryside, try capture that. But then on to productivity, and the desire to boost productivity is where I have this niggling doubt, which is productivity was explained to me as getting more out of the same, or the same out of less, or even better, more out of less, but it could go in reverse. And my real concern with economists is if the consumer doesn't behave like my economic model, the consumer must be wrong type attitude. But if as a result of all of this technology and all of these free goods, I choose to produce less output and read more books, then who's right and who's wrong?
Or watch more YouTube.
Or listen to them as well.
Or listen to Spotify, yes.
We have continuous play.
Yeah, of course. Well, if we only became, it would only take a 25% increase in productivity to move to 3-day weekend as a norm, right? So Keynes, as everybody knows, made that famous prediction that we would be consuming a lot more leisure, and for some reason it hasn't come about.
Sanjeev.
Sanjeev Mahajan from the Office for National Statistics. Firstly, I'd like to commend you on an excellent, well-balanced and informative presentation. Definitely want to emphasise that. That was excellent. Quite often I see variations and biases, and that was good. And I definitely like your lead in the education and the communication dimension. You know, no one's claimed GDP's whatever, wealth indicator. Come on, please. So, a couple of points I want to just draw out. Partly for some people have already mentioned them in a certain way. Firstly, you use your mobile phone to walk down the road, tell you to turn left, turn right, go around the roundabout, turn left, turn right, you might be there. You might not be. In the old days, you used to ask people, and they would hopefully be happy to tell you what direction to go. Is the art of communication disappearing? Interpersonal skills disappearing? One dimension you might want to comment on. And second aspect is, in the old days, very old days, people used to wash their clothes by hand, rinse them. Then came this thing called a washing machine. It's meant to save time, but somehow we substituted. Then came the dishwasher, etc. Now we're moving to a service substitution effect. Mm-hmm. What do you think about how we waste this extra time, because leisure and pleasure is not in GDP? Mm-hmm. My second point. And then more of a measurement theme linked to what Jennifer was saying. Now, the way I view it, those companies that operate domestically only, within a nation, not a problem. It's these multinational enterprise groups that are causing a problem when they cross the boundaries, and I don't want to lose sight of the IPP. Now, we know the multinationals move profits and etc. around to reduce their tax liability. But these multinationals, and I don't quite agree with Robin's point earlier on, they invest millions of dollars in protecting the IPP. Then they set them up in what we call a special purpose vehicle in the Bermuda Triangle. And the reason why I use that is they move them around and you cannot keep up with them. So my question to you is, how do you think, from your perspective, measurement of MNEs could be addressed? My personal view is we need to do a lot more of consolidation for international accounts, not the nation's accounts. Is the concept of the nation finished?
Oh, a lot of questions there. The issue about domestic production, the washing machine, the dryer, the dishwasher, the lawnmower, the sewing machine, on and on. Great question, because a lot of it was made domestic work more efficient, and its ultimate outcome was that it freed up women in particular, particularly elder daughters, to actually acquire education and work in the commercial sector. So you moved a lot of people over 30 or 40 30 years, I guess, out of the non-compensated domestic labor into compensated paid labor. So that was a really big, big effect. And then the other question about the complexity of international taxation, I think it's going to get a lot clearer, because many of those distortions were due to this weird trade practice in the US that you didn't pay taxes on funds until they were repatriated. Okay, so it wasn't really tax avoidance, it was tax delay, because it was just like a retirement account. You didn't pay taxes till you actually started drawing on the funds, and now the incentives for that are dramatically reduced. So most of the practices you're thinking of are going to disappear in the next few years. And so life will become easier in terms of accounting. Now there may be new, unforeseen loopholes that people will discover, but at least the existing practices are, you'll see a change within a year. Basically moving the IP back to its economic locus. But I asked one of our tax experts, is how do we get this screwy system of tax due and reparation? He said, well, there was a debate in Congress. One side said, don't tax foreign earnings at all. The other side said, tax them every year. And so they compromised, and they managed to get something that combined the worst of both alternatives. Well, there you go.
Can I tell you who the winner is?
The winner?
Yeah.
Okay.
The lawyers.
The lawyers. Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question up at the back here.
Well, given that this is the last question, I'm going to bring it back to monetary policy, which haven't been mentioned here, and given that we are in the Bank of England. So which are the challenges of these measurement issues for monetary policy? And an example that I'm thinking of, so you basically want to add things to GDP, value added, which strictly speaking has zero price. So in a sense, the link between GDP and inflation would be a bit loosened up, which is, I understand, a key relationship for monetary policy. So which do you think are challenges of these issues for monetary policy?
Well, measuring quantity, measuring prices, it's the same sort of thing. So all of these proposals about how you're measuring the level of output or the level of production or the level of welfare, for that matter, they're going to have a counterpoint in terms of how you measure prices. So that seems pretty direct. And then on top of that, I guess there would be a lot of issues about, well, how close are we to full capacity? Maybe we just haven't implemented some of the changes that are possible because we didn't feel the pressure to do so, and as the economy becomes more and more tight, you would see some of these practices diffuse a little more rapidly. But I guess my view is we'll see how that develops. Every change that you're making in measuring real output shows up as a counterpart on pricing. Just turn it upside down, and there you are. You know? So that's my guess, at least. So thank you.
So I think I have to mention we have a short break now and lunch next door at 12:30. So thank you very, very much for such a wonderful talk and also for enduring so many questions. Thank you.